Hello, everyone. We thank you for joining us for today's webcast sponsored by DACRA. I want to let you know as you're filing in, going to give about a minute or so for everyone to get in and get settled, but you are in the right place, and we thank you for joining us. Just want to welcome everyone, let you know you're in the right place. This is the webcast sponsored by DACRA, giving everyone about another 30 seconds to get filed in and get settled. An official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. What don't you see? Reveal and resolve blind spots hampering high reliability. Sponsored by DACRA. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all are safe and well. In a few minutes, we'll start our presentation, but first let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we will conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and we'll let you know more about that after the presentation. Today's webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today, they're Rajni Walia, George Bauer, and Mike Snyder. Rajni is a vice president at DACRA North America who leads the organization's human performance improvement practice. She brings more than a decade of experience leading performance management, organizational assessment, and development. George is a vice president at DACRA North America. He's committed to helping organizations achieve sustainable safety and health excellence through accountable leadership, detailed planning, effective training, clear and concise policies and procedures, systems-based auditing, and the completion of corrective actions. Mike is Vice President of Operational Risk Management at DACRA North America. He leads the organization's operational risk management practice. Mike is a retired fire chief and fire marshal and currently serves on the Center for Chemical Process Safety Governance Board. We thank you all for being here today. Mike, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to have a conversation about identifying and resolving blind spots that have risk and exposure to your organization. The outline for today's conversation is going to be starting with a discussion about the emerging consensus about world-class environmental health and safety performance being a natural outcome of embracing and adopting the principles of high reliability. And a quick conversation then about those concepts of high reliability and really the risk-based decision-making that underpins and underlies that. And central to that conversation is that organizations that are highly reliable are very effective at both identifying and resolving blind spots and kind of unanticipated exposures that occur in the workplace, and find ways before incidents and problems occur to raise and resolve those issues. And we'll be then taking a bit of an exploration into two particular areas that have seemed to be very, very effective in leading in world-class organizations. And the first is the use of a holistic assessment across the EH&S enterprise to look and identify where blind spots might exist, list and find ways then to get them quickly identified and resolved. And then finally, we'll talk about the serious injury and fatality prevention process and how to identify and resolve those exposures that have significant impact that can permanently disable or kill an employee within the workplace. And then we'll finish up with a summary and call to action. And again, we'll have time for questions at the end and would very much like to engage in conversations with you and ask that you put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll work on fielding those. So by way of calibration, highly reliable organizations are a group of organizations that are getting a lot of attention recently because they are performing at world-class levels for today's conversation in environmental health and safety, but really across the enterprise in quality and cost and customer satisfaction. And they're doing this despite being in inherently risky and oftentimes complex organizations. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to understand what makes those organizations tick. And so, what I would like to do before we get into the conversation about risk-based decision making in highly reliable organizations is ask one of our three poll questions today. And really to kind of get a flavor for the experiences of the folks who are attending in today's webinar, I'd like you to just pick one of the following solution or following answers to what major challenges are you facing today in delivering world-class EH&S performance? And is that you're limited in resources? Are there really a lack of practical tools and processes to identify gaps in your programs? Are there limited abilities in your organization to focus on those exposures that create the most significant factors and impact to your EH&S program? Or are there simply too many other improvement initiatives underway? And so we'll give you just a few seconds here, about 30 seconds to answer this, and very much would like to get kind of a feel for the audience in your experiences here. So. Okay, so in the poll results, resource limitations are really leading the pack here at about a half. And then really following their lack of practical tools, then followed by limited ability and too many other improvement initiatives underway. And so this is very aligned with the experience we have, right? There are a lot of activities and challenges with our resource base today. And obviously, if you don't have a set of practical tools, even in a resource-constrained environment, it becomes much more difficult to manage these types of risks and exposures. And so we'll try to make sure that we are emphasizing those particular areas of concern as we further our conversation today. So as I start to talk about high reliability organization and risk-based decision making, the secret sauce, so to speak, in this area is the fact that these organizations seem to be able to align their resource allocation proportional to the risk and exposure that exist in an organization. And I always like to use this simplified risk matrix. Most organizations have a risk matrix that is more complex and detailed here, but conceptually, this will serve the purposes for today's conversation. And in this model with consequence on the y-axis, probability on the x-axis, you kind of have a very simple part where those things that present high consequence that happen frequently, you would put at the top of the prioritization pile, followed next, if we thought about this just kind of intellectually, where those things that present high consequence with lower frequency, followed by the bottom right, where you would have a lower consequence that happened frequently. And then if you had any available resource after that, low consequence, low frequency. And so really you'd kind of go red, orange, yellow, green. But the reality in today's fast-paced and challenging business environment is those things that sit in front of you on a day-to-day basis, the things that are making the most noise, tend to get the attention of the organization. And so, the good news is the top priority of those things that are high consequence, high frequency, with a couple of notable exceptions, are ones that get attention. And then we immediately go down to those things that are low consequence, but typically happen on a higher frequency, leaving us with a bit of a blind spot in the areas of high consequence, low frequency, which oftentimes can be things that are really a huge risk factor to the enterprise and its ability to sustain itself in catastrophic incident prevention and other aspects of environmental as well as occupational safety performance. And so the efforts that high reliability organizations embark upon is stretching that lens to include that additional area, which is historically a blind spot, and incorporating that really into the prioritization scheme. And so as organizations are looking at how to do this, there has been a large amount of research in the last 20 years. I have just emphasized and highlighted the ones done by Professor Sutcliffe and Wyke from the University of Michigan, where there are 5 attributes in organizations that seem to manage this very well. And ultimately, while this is a risk-based decision-making process, this is an area where exposures, and particularly exposures that are maybe not well known or yet well understood, are categorized, the controls are put in place, and then culture and capability in the organization is made to uncover those areas where maybe you have a vulnerable blind spot and get it adequately resolved. And so it really becomes an area of inventorying your risks and controls. And the good news is most organizations have a fundamental risk, whether risk repository, whether that's PHAs, whether that's HAZOPs, whether that's job safety analyses. And so while there are obviously opportunities to improve the breadth and comprehensiveness of these, most organizations have a good start here. The areas where we really need to work on focusing more attention is the middle piece here about being vigilant to early warning signs of when problems arise, tee those up and have the organization productively embrace those and drive them to resolution. That really demarks one of the major differences in organizations that become highly reliable. The fourth one is operational discipline, and that sounds so easy, but it's, first time right, making sure that the procedures that are established are followed well. But ultimately, human error becomes a significant factor in this, and a more progressive and modern view about the elements of human error and human performance reliability are central and embraced by these organizations. And then last but not least, while you want to look at lagging indicators, everyone does that, you need to be much more comprehensive by looking at things further upstream that really start to articulate the risk and exposures and find ways that you can build capability around these and really use those as indicators that are kind of mileposts on the journey to low incident rates and other aspects of highly reliable performance. And so setting the stage, those organizations that are on the journey or are starting to approach the levels of world-class environmental health and safety embrace those 5 principles that we talked about just on the previous slide. And that is really the basis of their management program. The second part, which we are finding to be more and more impactful, is that if you embrace an unbiased assessment of how well your EH&S program is managing those risks and really at times identifying if there are risks that aren't being properly managed, i.e. the blind spots, by doing that holistically across the EH&S portfolio. The third part is the culture of vulnerability. And again, that close call, near miss, early warning signs, and then making sure there's an adequate governance model to track progress and drive improvement. This is really kind of the backbone of what successfully will start to drive you towards this world-class area to start to uncover and open up your eyes to the blind spots that you have. And so really now following up to this conversation, George will pick up to talk about the holistic assessment process that we have just briefly mentioned, and then Rajni Walia in just a few minutes will talk about serious injury and fatality management and precursor identification. So George, I'll kick it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so Mike just provided us a very good brief overview of what a highly reliable organization looks like and the framework surrounding that. And so, if I'm like you, I'm asking myself the question, or I'm saying the statement, I want to be highly reliable as well, right? How can we go about eliminating serious or catastrophic incidents within our organization? And to be able to get to that end goal elimination of serious and catastrophic incidents, we've got to first know where we are, right? So it's important that we know where we are so we can develop our path forward. I use the analogy, if you're driving in a location that's unfamiliar to you, typically we pull out our GPS, right? We pull out our phone, punch in an address, and we use our GPS system. Well, the first thing that that GPS system has to know to get us to our end destination that we want to be at is where are we sitting currently, right? If we don't know where we are, it's impossible for us to get to where we want to go. Same concept here. So when we think about assessing organizations, honesty and that unbiased look is what's most important. We don't do ourselves any justice if we don't have that honest, unbiased, introspective look at where we sit today. And not only thinking about our opportunities, right? The things that we know are potentially broken, but also what about our strengths? It's important to oftentimes we focus too much on our weaknesses without playing to our strengths. So we want to look at it from both perspectives. And without that knowledge and that understanding of where those strengths and opportunities lie, we can't get to our destination. And if we think about it in this concept of what you see on the slide here, we call it a safety maturity continuum. Our destination is the right-hand side, right? I feel certain everybody that's on the webinar today and going to be viewing it in the future, they want to be moving towards the world-class arena. So on your screen there, you see 6 descriptors. Again, like I said, we call that our safety maturity continuum. And they range from, on the left-hand side, safety is looked at as a burden, to over the right side, we're world-class. And every organization falls somewhere along this continuum. So let's just break this down for a couple of minutes. On the far left, if you look at burden and necessities, if your organization is in one of those 2 categories, you're in what we call the avoidance mode. The avoidance mode. So safety is viewed as a burden. It's required by outside organizations. The regulators drive it, and it's something that we must do, right? We got to do it because it's regulatory requirement. And typically in these type of organizations, the owners of safety are a lot of times the safety department. If you move over towards the right a little bit into those middle 2 groupings of priority and goal, in this arena, we're in what we call the compliance mode. Now we're starting to move in the direction we want to move, right? Responsibility for safety is taken on by senior leaders. Operations is beginning to own safety. Now, while there might be some gaps in the systems, we recognize we're moving and trending in the right direction. And then ultimately, we get over into the far right side, into that values and world class. And we call that a values mode. We're really those organizations that are in that category 5 or that category 6, value or world class, they fully believe that there's intrinsic worth to people's safety, and they value that. They hold on very strongly to that concept. It's woven into everything they do. It is a part of their DNA. It's a part of their culture. Those are organizations that are highly reliable. So as we continue on, I'm willing to bet that you guys are looking at that screen there, and you probably have self-graded yourself. So we've got a second poll question to come up for you. Here you've got the 6 categories, world-class to burden. You've got a little definition associated with it. So why don't we take the next 45 seconds or so, if you wouldn't mind, answer just your gut feel on where you feel your organization is. And it could be your team, it could be your site, it could be your organization as a whole. Look, just gauge where you feel you guys are. Give it a few more seconds. All right. So we got a nice bell curve, it appears there. So 33% of folks believe they were in the values arena. That's fantastic. You got about 45% are in that middle bucket, either that goal or the priority. And then about a fifth of our participants here today consider your maturity in that lower end of the spectrum, in that necessity, and another couple percent within the burden as well. So interesting. Typical bell curve, very typical for what we see with organizations that we as DECRO that we work with. Now, as we transition over to, we recognize where we are today, right? We thought about, just our own self perspective on where we land on that maturity continuum. Well, let's talk about, what holistic means, first of all, and what a holistic safety assessment really does. Let me define for you holistic. So I looked this up as well too. It's one of those buzzwords that is going around for the past few years that people are really seeming to cling on to. And it's important that we're well grounded though what it means. So let me just define it for you. It's holistic is a belief that the parts of something are interconnected and can be explained only by reference to the whole. All right. So when we think about holistic in the venue of safety, what we're thinking about is there's various different aspects the organization have that drive safety performance. It's either going to be a benefit to safety performance or it can be a detriment to safety performance. And you'll see up on the screen there's 5 components. But oftentimes, whenever we hear organizations or we have conversations with organizations that say something to the effect of, we just had a fatality last week or a serious incident that occurred last week. Let's say it's within a confined space entry. Now we need you, third party, to come in and fix our confined space entry program. Sure, a third party can come in and help you out, likely with your program, shoring up your program, looking at the various components of it, et cetera. But is that really what's going on that led to that fatality? Is it simply a function of your exposure control system or some other interaction between our employees in that system that led to that fatality? Or is there more to that picture? And that's really where this holistic safety approach comes in. So, the holistic safety allows us to get a snapshot of the organization and understand where those opportunities exist. Those opportunities also can be termed your blind spots. So that those opportunities are what are preventing us from moving from wherever we're graded, right, on that maturity continuum. It's what's preventing us from being in that world-class arena. For those of you folks that are familiar with industrial hygiene and either in practice or through other consultative efforts, within industrial hygiene, we all often use 2 different types of assessments. One being a qualitative assessment that really frames up for us, where are our issues potentially going to lie, so that therefore we can direct resources in the appropriate spots through a quantitative assessment. And in the lean environments that we all work in today, this is the same type of approach where we can qualitatively, now granted, there can be some quantitative aspects to it, but really we're trying to look at an overall holistic view, qualitatively speaking, on where the organization lies, where the strengths, where the opportunities are. And it really dives into those 5 buckets that you see there listed. You've got leadership and culture, exposure control systems, operational interface, performance management, and governance. And let's break down each one of those for you real quick. So within leadership and culture, what we're talking about is the way we do things around here. What's in our DNA? What is the underlying values and beliefs that are shared across our organization, and they're levers that leaders can pull to create that transformational change that we're looking for in pursuit of that world-class EHS excellence. Some aspects we would consider within this bucket of leadership and culture are, just the overall culture, right? How is it that we approach things within the organization? How do we get the workforce involved in various safety and operational aspects. And then also, what do we do for outreach to both internal and external stakeholders? And when we look at the bucket of leadership and culture, we call it a domain. But when we look at that domain of leadership and culture, you can grade yourself through specific lines of inquiry and observations and various other tactical aspects of a holistic assessment, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, to determine where you lie. And you see over on the right-hand side there, you might lie in that level 6, that world class, right? Where HSE is identified is the identity of leaders and workers, right? High sensitivity to subtle changes in exposure control. Or maybe you're on the other end of the spectrum where it's a hindrance to leadership. It's just something we've got to do. It's a burden. We're more focused in on the cost associated with it. And incidents and accidents and injuries, that's the cost of doing business, right? So part of that holistic assessment is going to look through that domain of leadership and culture. The second one is around our exposure control systems. So here's where we're going to address environmental health and safety, our processes, the exposures of people to hazards, and enable a highly functioning controls for the elimination of those exposures. So what do we have within our systems, our operating procedures, our safe work practices? Maybe we have a hazard identification and a risk management process, or our management of change. What do we do within those arenas within exposure control systems domain to determine where we lie? Again, where's our roadmap? Where's our GPS telling us we are currently through that honest, unbiased look? World-class, again, exposure control is integral to everything that we do. It aligns with our potential impacts and evolves with learnings. We are a learning organization, right? We take failures that we have experienced, and we learn from them, and we apply fixes universally across the organization. Versus the other side, from the burden. Think about it from the burden perspective. Exposure control documents, they're absent, right? We don't really have exposure control mechanisms in place. Errors from our employees, we go straight to the discipline approach, right? We're going to fix the employee versus fixing the system. Or the other side of the coin where, just getting the job done. I don't care how you get there, just get it done. If you got to take 25 shortcuts to get it done, that's fine. Here's your attaboy for that. Next time I want you to rinse that process. Do the same thing over again. So we've got that full spectrum we want to look at within our exposure control systems. The third domain is around operational interface. And here we're looking at the interactions and the influences of our programs and how that interacts with our employees in the operational setting. So we think about things like compliance with standards or operational discipline, emergency management. Those are going to be all areas and aspects within the operational interface domain that we're going to want to look at. And the same approach as we look at it from the culture or the maturity continuum applies as well. Again, world-class to the far right. It's integral, fully embraced as a key work element. Workers value the process and the confidence that's created as a part of that. Or there's little attention to the structure and the systems necessary to guide delivery within our health, safety, and environmental expectations. So you fall somewhere in that 1 to 6 category within your operational interface. Fourth would be performance management. And this is one that's often overlooked, but it can be a significant driver to what gets measured, gets managed well, right? So if I'm highly focused on performance management from a productivity standpoint, that's what my leadership is going to pay attention to, right? That's going to be the driving force behind their decision making. So within performance management, where we are looking at the capability and the competency of our employees and addressing underperformance in a timely manner. So training, performance assurance, those are aspects we're looking at. Competency within our understandings of health, safety, and environmental. And then again, we look at it from our maturity continuum. If you're over in the world-class arena, You've got the structures, you've got the process, you've got the systems. They're all in place. They're fully integrated to support our excellence that we're seeking in our health, safety, environmental outcomes. The burden side, performance management is absent, right? Including worker advancement. So how do we seek to promote and recognize and reward those individuals that are meeting our intents? Rewards are typically aligned with production, right? So think about it to your own organization. What are we rewarding, and how is that potentially benefiting or being a detriment to our safety performance? And then last but not least, absolutely not least, because probably the most integral and vital aspect is going to be around governance. And these are going to be the means in which the organization sets your HSE direction. It's how we monitor performance and ensuring that we've got the adequate resources to not only achieve what we want to see within our culture, but sustain that long term. And we look at aspects around measurements and metrics. Your leading, your lagging indicators. What is our focus and our emphasis on? How do we handle auditing? What does our incident investigation process look like? These are all aspects within governance that either tends to drive us more towards that world-class side, or again, back towards the burden side. So the holistic assessment really helps us to understand where we are and begin our journey on the destination to world-class. All right, so as we look at, we think about the domains and the buckets, from a tactical aspect, just wanted to very briefly mention to you an approach, okay? This is not the approach, but this is an approach that you can use to holistically look at your safety management system. And there's really 4 phases that I'd like for you to offer up to you for consideration. The first phase really revolves around your data and your documentation. So what are the things that we need to be reviewing in advance in preparation to get our eyes, our minds around what we expect to see when we're there on site, or engaging with leadership and or employees within the organization. And within the data and documentation, that phase 1, we're going to look at things like analyzing performance data. So it could be your incident data. It could be your corrective actions. It could be things around your strength, your hierarchy of controls, how strong our controls are. It could be things around serious injury and fatality prevention, SIF potential rates, things of that nature, worker compensation. Really, it's going to be those things that help to drive a better understanding of how the organization operates and what are the metrics that they value as an organization, engaging how effective we are within safety. And really, this is a foundational baseline information gathering part of the assessment, where it helps to drive that later decision making within the holistic assessment. Phase 2 is where we start to get into some of the weeds, and we start to dig in through specific lines of inquiry and understand the points of view and the perspectives of leadership through surveys and executive alignment. We can offer things like a diagnostic survey where we can get a full comprehensive view of the various cultural aspects and within the organization that is driving safety performance. Like I said, leadership point of view is another one. And then also the assessment of your actual safety management system. Some of that might have been done in phase 1, but we can do a deeper dive based on our findings within phase 1 to help educate and drive direction within phase 2 through that survey and executive alignment. Phase 3 is going to be our in-field observations and engagements. So whether it's a third party that you're bringing in or something that you're looking to do internal, this is when we're going to get out into the field. This is not solely a desktop exercise. You cannot fully understand what is occurring within your organization without being in your organization. And I mean being out on the line. So here we're going to have various levels of interviews, from senior leadership, top individuals at a facility, down to line employees. And based upon their position and their role in the organization, there's specific things that we want to gauge from them. We want to get between the ears and understand their perspectives and their point of views on how safety performs. What's working well, what's not, where do our greatest exposures lie? What do we need to truly be highly reliable? We'll perform some field observations of engagements between leadership and employees, and then also do field verifications of the systems and processes. So those things that we learned through phase 1 and phase 2, now we can use the trust but verify type approach, right? Where we understood them in the first couple of phases. Now we're going out to verify and seeing, is what we say on paper truly what's going on in the field? Because we all know, organizations have great policies and procedures, but that doesn't often translate to how work is actually being done within the field. And then finally, we've got our closeout. So here we develop a series of strategic recommendations. So based upon our information that we've gathered through the first 3 phases, now we want to decide, okay, what is the strategy to take us from that level 3, right? From that priority and take us to that world class. What are the big items that we need to address? And then we take that strategy and those recommendations and develop the hows we get there, right? The tactical applications, the roadmap in which, okay, these are the turns we're going to take at these specific roads to ensure that we get to our world-class, the world-class aspect within the maturity continuum. So ultimately, that's going to lead to our implementation piece. But it takes a number of necessary steps to get to implementation. We can't start directly at one aspect of it. To do a holistic approach, it's parts of the system that represent the whole. So as we look at reliability and assessment, and we think about the concepts that we talked about both through Mike and maybe a couple things that I shared with you as well too, wanted to transition over to maybe how some of this might look specifically around serious injury and fatality prevention. And I'll turn it over to Rajni at this point.
All right. Thank you so much, George. And thank you everyone for joining us. George, that was very insightful in terms of how to do a holistic assessment and really gauge where organizations at. I'm going to go into an additional blind spot, as George mentioned, which is all around how to prevent these serious injuries that occur, and we'll transition into a poll. And so for this poll, what we're going to ask you to think about is, what is your organization's experience with life-altering ending events occurring in the workplace? Are you surprised when this type of exposure exists in the work environment? Do you not fully understand the worker risk presented by this type of exposure? Do you believe that the existing control measures adequately manage this exposure? Or do you have a learning event process to implement critical improvements into your systems? So if you wouldn't mind participating with us and completing this poll, that would be fantastic. Maybe another couple of seconds, and then what we'll do is we'll share with you the findings of this. Thank you for being such a participative audience. So the results are, let's see, the nice distribution again. So 40% believe that the existing controls adequately measure that type of exposure. Perfect. 30%, about a third, said you have an event learning process in place to incorporate critical exposures. Fantastic. And then there's about a third that are surprised that this type of exposure occurs, or that they don't fully understand the worker risk presented. So very well aligned with some of what we see across our client organizations. Now let's talk more specifically around why it is that some of this mindset, or why it is that these blind spots can occur. The first thing that we often hear when we work with organizations is that the recordable injury log, well, what we find is that it's absolutely misleading when it comes to CIF exposure. We work with organizations that have very low recordable rates to ones that may be struggling a little bit. But the ones that have low recordable rates, just because the recordable injury rate is low, doesn't actually mean that there's an absence of CIF exposure. In fact, it's quite misleading. I know I've been in several discussions with the company where they say, yeah, we're actually really good. Our recordable injury rate is 0.2. Then once we got to start actually digging deeper into some of their exposures, their SIF-P, or their SIF, serious injury and fatality prevention potential exposure rate, was at a 28%, which means almost 1 in 3 injuries that they had could have resulted in a serious injury or fatality. So simply looking at that log by itself is not indicative and not a good exposure. In fact, a lot of times what we do is when we go into plant sites, organizations, and you see, that they've been this many days injury free, oftentimes what it does, that the lower number is achieved because that's what everybody deems as important to the organization. So in fact, what might be happening is that the injury rate might be driven down because there's so much of a focus on the injury rate. So be careful not to sort of over glamorize this incident rate, because it could drive unhelpful behavior as well. So if we go to the next slide, what we know is that the SIF blind spot is significant. So we've done a lot of research in serious injury and fatality prevention over many years. And what we find is that there's probably about 25% is what we see as the average as the SIF potential rate across industry. So it is quite significant when you think about it. 1 in 4 incidents have the potential to result in that. And the reason why the blind spot is so significant is if you think about the Heinrich triangle, which is what most people think of when they think about the injury rate, and you see all of this stuff at the top, yes, it's naturally going to be small, but everything at the bottom that's when it gets bigger. A lot of times with the Heinrich triangle is said, if you reduce everything, you can reduce all of the stuff at the top. And what we see is that that's actually not the case. Impacting the top of the triangle by working on the bottom, it doesn't, while the triangle is predictive, is descriptive, it's not predictive. And it's not truly the case in that way. The other thing that we often hear is that SIFs occur, they're one-off. That's also not true. There's often a systematic reason why they're occurring. Culture, I know George talked about doing a holistic assessment to understand how to get to world class. Oftentimes culture plays into it, leadership plays into it. So there are blind spots that, if there are blind spots, it's best to understand why it is that they're occurring and how it is that they're occurring. The next thing is that leaders must be educated must do 4 things to prevent serious injuries and fatalities. What are they? The first one is be educated on it. Understand that this is a problem before others can act on it. Don't just go off of your incident log and your injury log and say, yeah, we're good. We have a pretty low recordable rate. Understand that the solutions to the SIF problem require regular attention, and be a sponsor and say, and when injuries occur, find out why, go deeper. Explore not only on the responsive side, which I'll share with you in a moment, but be proactive about it. And understand also, so the second one is provide visibility to SIF exposure. Have clear definitions. How do you define life-altering versus life-threatening? How do you determine your SIF exposure potential? And calculate your SIF-P rate so that you know what it is that you're dealing with. You know what it is that's causing most of your SIF potential injuries. You should know what type of exposure categories they're coming from. Know your precursors is the third one. There are 3 places where they generally hide. The first one is high risk activities, high exposure risks, high exposure tasks. Second one, it could be hiding is your management systems. They might be missing, deficient, or not, they might not be complied with. And the third one is all to do with leadership and culture. If something has been allowed to continue, it will continue to happen. So this is why, going back to some of what Mike and George were talking about, it's important to determine where it is that some of your blind spots might be, because they might be hiding in one of those 3. The last one is integrate interventions into your existing safety management system so that it's not an isolated event. It's not an isolated thing that you're looking at, but integrate it into your life-saving rules, your job safety analysis. And if you have stop work, integrate into that. integrated into your incident management system. So as soon as incidents occur, you're able to determine whether that SIF potential was there and present. Now, what I'm going to share with you is the model. So we've put together a model for SIF prevention, and this model goes at it in sort of two ways. The first way is a responsive side. This is where a lot of companies that we work with are doing something in the vein of serious injury and fatality prevention, and a lot of it typically starts on the responsive side. So they know they might be measuring it, they might be tracking it, they might have a SIF-P rate. So they're, depending on the maturity of the organization, they could be at any one of these levels. But what we do is we generally want to unpack in this model, because this is how we define good looks like. So on the responsive side, you have immediate classification. So as soon as an incident occurs, you're looking at it from the potential side. Not did something actually happen or not, but did it have the potential to cause a serious injury or fatality? We then want to see, are there initial controls in place? Because if an incident has occurred in site A, there's a very strong likelihood it could occur somewhere else. So you want to make sure that you have controls in place so that it doesn't happen again. You want to understand context. Why is it that this injury occurred? We know from a human performance perspective, we're strong believers that people don't just willingly and knowingly go out and do things where they can put themselves in danger. There's probably something driving their behavior. And so we want to understand what it is that was driving their behavior. We also want to look at the corrective actions, and for the corrective actions, we look at the hierarchy of controls, and we want most of the corrective actions to be on the upper half, in that the exposure is either eliminated, or there's a substitute, or it's engineered out. Most typically, we find that it's the opposite, in that a lot of the corrective actions are sitting at the bottom half of the hierarchy of controls, and that there's a training or administrative control that's put in place, and that is not effective in changing human behavior. And then event learning. Are you truly learning from your event? If you have incidents that are repeated incidents, your organization is probably not learning from them, and therefore they're going to continue to happen until you get to the root cause and really figure out why it is that they're occurring. And on the top side of this model, we have the proactive side, which is aligning systems to the level of SIF exposure that you have. So if you have a lot of exposures where you have planned activities, where you know people are going to be doing a certain task at this hour in this way, these are all of the systems, and these are all of the tools and processes that you need, you can get really good and effective at planning, having good job briefings, having good field verification. On the flip side, if a lot of your SIF exposures are coming from unplanned, unscheduled events where you're reliant solely on individuals and humans to make a decision in the moment, we need to be better at equipping them in the right type of sort of decision-making ability, so that they can recognize when an exposure change occurs. That's often a challenge of ours. How to pause, how to intervene when you see somebody doing something. These are all challenges that we need to make people aware of, and need to provide them tools to overcome some of those challenges. And in the middle is what's really important, like George was talking about. Part of our holistic assessment is we look at governance. How effective is it? And if you have a model like this, you're able to track, you're able to trend, you're able to measure. Are you really getting after the items and the things that have the greatest potential to hurt somebody? And do you have exposure reduction teams dedicated and focused solely on examining the health of this process and looking for some of those weak signals like Mike was talking about earlier on? So what do you do to resolve risk blindness? There is a really critical role of leadership and culture, and it's about shifting mindset from it can't happen here to it very well can happen here. It can happen at any moment, and we need to be better at anticipating. So we need to expect the unexpected, always be looking for the unexpected, have a culture of openness where people can speak up, can voice their opinion, where it's a safe it's psychologically safe to share, yeah, you know what, there might be a better way to do something. So off where people feel comfortable offering up their opinion. It's and safe to challenge assumptions. These are, while it's easy in theory, it's very difficult in practice. So you have to have a culture where there's support for all of this, and ensuring accuracy, ensuring this mindset that we're focused on precision and getting things right. And so we will do whatever it takes and have the resources necessary so that we can ensure accuracy and precision. Being agile, knowing that risk is dynamic. And lastly, learning from our failures and mistakes and being open to it, openly acknowledging that, yeah, you know, in this event, we messed up. We messed up as leaders, we messed up as an organization, and we need to do differently. We need to do something differently. So acknowledging that, being an organization where you're open to feedback, are all critical. So what's the the call to action here? All right, is there's a few things that we'd ask you to maybe consider. Challenge your organization to think differently about catastrophic events. I know we're going through a holistic assessment with an organization to try to understand where are they, what can they do differently to get better, to get at that world class, because they certainly don't want catastrophic events to occur. And really be asking yourselves, how are you managing the most severe incident exposures? Is there a different focus? That's the other thing I didn't mention. Having a, you know, a cut versus somebody who nearly fell out of a bucket truck, those are very different and they have to be looked at very differently. And so think about how you're managing the most severe incident exposures. Become vulnerable as a leader. Embrace this idea that thing it can happen here. As you know, I was in a discussion with a plant manager not too long ago, and I said, you know, if it gets really quiet in your plant, there's probably something wrong there. That means people are not communicating. They're getting a little too comfortable. So ask questions. Ask, you know, why, you know, if our next injury could occur, what would occur? Where would it occur from? And do we have the controls in place to mitigate against them? It's always worthwhile to conduct an independent holistic assessment, because if you work in a place and you're there day in, day out, you may not see some of these blind spots that might be creeping up. So it's absolutely worthwhile to look at. We've given you a framework today that shows you some of the aspects that you might look at and consider, but do consider an independent assessment, because it will open your eyes in a lot of ways and help you unpack what some of your challenges might be. And then work to enhance the culture, competency, and management system so that you really are thinking about the most serious types of exposures that could occur, that I know every person on this call doesn't want to happen in their organization. So on behalf of the three of us, thank you for being here. And I know we'd love to stay connected. And I know, Kevin, we'll turn it over to you. I'm sure there are some questions that the audience might want to ask. Meanwhile, feel free to connect with us. We'd love to connect with you. Feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So Kevin,
Excellent.
back to you.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Great job to the three of you, Rajni, George, and Mike. We thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise. Before we do start that Q&A, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete. The survey will open at a different screen after this webinar. We appreciate your input as it helps us to improve our future webcasts. Once again, if you'd like to ask a question of our panel today, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button to submit. If we don't get to your question today, all unanswered questions will be forwarded along to our speakers. With that, the first question is for George, and it asks, what are some of the typical reasons that organizations use a holistic EHS assessment to identify blind spots?
Yeah, great question, Kevin. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons, but let me just maybe throw out a couple of reasons why an organization might want to take the approach of a holistic assessment. Number one, there's a desire, there's a directive to get better, right? So, you know, the organization, either senior leadership or the organization as a whole, has to have that desire that they don't like where we sit currently, right? Whether they've gone through the efforts and the steps of clearly understanding where they lie within the maturity continuum or not, they probably have a gut feel that they're not comfortable with where they are currently, right? So maybe there's some directive from senior leadership, or there's a desire to improve. Another example might be a reason why you'd want to conduct a holistic assessment would be to fully understand where those opportunities lie. Again, if our goal is to move ourselves to world class, right? We value human health. We value our employees' ability to come in and make a living, right? The holistic assessment is one approach that we can use to gain that full, complete understanding of where some of those opportunities might lie. And then finally, I'll say, Kevin, that if we think about something like incidents, and we want to better understand why certain incidents are continuing to occur. So again, let's say there's a hot work. We've had a number of hot work type incidents, and those can certainly be serious or catastrophic. And we've gone back through and it's kind of similar to what we talked about around the confined space analogy, that we've gone back through, we've retrained, we've disciplined employees, we've added additional PPE, et cetera, kind of some of the normal standard operating procedures we as organizations in safety, those levers we typically pull. But we want to try to better understand where and why those things are occurring, because chances are there's something hidden below the waterline that's creating that exposure that's being driven by one of those 5 domains. And we're tired of spinning our wheels. So I would say those would be 3 reasons why an organization might want to take the approach of a holistic assessment.
All righty. Well, thank you. Pivoting now, I have a question a question and a half, I guess, for Rajni. The first was wanting to backtrack on the comment considering the Heinrich triangle. It was something to the effect of it's predictive, but not. And the attendee was
so what I was saying, thank you, Kevin, for that question. And thank you for the audience member for that question. So what I was actually saying is that it's descriptive, not predictive, right? In that the shape is always gonna look like the way it is. So you're gonna have the most serious injuries. They're gonna be the least amount. Typically the ones at the bottom are gonna be the ones that are like your first aid, your near misses. So it is descriptive, but it's not a predictive model, and that if you reduce everything, the stuff at the top will also reduce.
Okay, thank you. This one also is for you, and it asks, as work teams consider the impact of serious injury and fatality exposures in their operations, what are some of the common challenges faced when making a commitment to embrace this approach, and also how do leading firms overcome them?
A common challenge is thinking that it can't happen here. And thinking that, yeah, all of the exposures are essentially the same. A lot of times it's just they're looking and at the numbers and saying, yeah, look, we have a very low injury log, but what we find in the research is that even though you might have a really low recordable number, your SIF-P potential rate is probably averaging about 25%. Some are higher, some organizations are lower. So embracing that you are going to have a subset of your exposure is going to have SIF potential, and knowing that addressing those, you're going to have to take a little bit of a different approach.
All right, thank you. Next question goes to Mike, and it asks, what advice can you provide to an EHS professional who is facing company culture that enables thinking that it can't happen here?
So I'll link into the conversation that really has gone through all 3 of our discussions here, and that's about becoming a stronger, vulnerable leader. And again, as crazy as this sounds, by starting a conversation with colleagues, with work groups, with employees in your area, that simply transition the mindset from it can't happen here to an open question about how can it happen here and what are we doing about it, is one of the most effective ways to, first of all, show your interest and commitment and concern for these exposures in the workplace. And it really starts when you have a legitimate and sincere commitment. It opens up that conversation, and you will get the gift of blind spots, close calls, and early warnings being shared with you from the folks who are most likely to see them. And then obviously, right, at times it creates a burden on you as the leader, because then you're going to have to help address and resolve. But in the end, it gives you great efficiency because you're not then spending all this reactive time in follow-up. So again, it sounds a little hokey on the surface, but it works. I can tell you personally in my industrial experience and with the clients that we work with, it's a very effective way to be an icebreaker in this area.
Thank you. We are running low on time. As we do wrap up, any closing thoughts from any of the three of you?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for their interest in high reliability and world-class safety, and these aspects, number one, about holistic assessment, and secondly, the comprehensive process of serious injury and fatality prevention and the exposure controls as a way to improve the way that risk management is done in your organization. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us if you want to have a more in-depth conversation on any of these points.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but again, all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded along to our speakers. Once again, we hope you take the time and fill out the forthcoming evaluation survey and give us your feedback. With that, we end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Rajni Walia, George Bauer, Mike Snyder, everyone at DACRA, and all of you who listened in. Thanks and have a great day.